The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the biting chill of an unforgiving winter night. James Carter gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black sedan, his hands clad in thin leather gloves. The heater hummed quietly, providing a weak buffer against the freezing air outside. Snowflakes swirled in chaotic patterns, sticking to the windshield as his wipers worked tirelessly to keep the view ahead clear. It had been a long day at the office, and all James wanted was to get home, kick off his polished shoes, and sink into the warmth of his living room with his wife and daughter. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that only a snowstorm could bring. His usual route home was blocked by icy conditions, forcing him to take an unfamiliar detour through the less maintained side of town. As he drove through the dimly lit streets, a faint unease settled in his chest. The glowing headlights of his car cast long, flickering shadows against the brick walls of abandoned warehouses and graffiti-covered storefronts. James was lost in thought, reflecting on an important meeting earlier that day, when the sudden glare of flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror jolted him back to the present. The siren's wail pierced the silence, echoing in the cold night air. "Great," he muttered under his breath, signaling and pulling over to the curb. His tires crunched against the icy snow as the car came to a stop. He rolled down the window, letting the frigid air bite at his face. His breath formed visible clouds as he waited for the officer to approach. The seconds dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last, until finally, two figures emerged from the police cruiser. Both officers, bundled in heavy winter jackets, approached the car with slow, deliberate steps. The taller of the two, an older man with a stern expression and a flashlight in hand, knocked on the driver's side window. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone clipped and cold. James handed over the documents without hesitation, his movements calm but cautious. "Good evening, officer," he said, his voice steady. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The officer ignored his question, shining the flashlight directly into James's eyes. "Where are you headed?" "Home," James replied, blinking against the harsh light. "I took a detour because the main road was blocked by snow." The second officer, younger and stockier, circled around the car, peering into the back seat through the frosted windows. He smirked, then muttered something under his breath that James couldn't quite make out. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer ordered abruptly, his voice leaving no room for argument. James hesitated. "Is there a problem, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." "Step out now," the officer repeated, each word dripping with impatience. With a sigh, James unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The cold air enveloped him immediately, cutting through his tailored overcoat. He stepped onto the icy ground, his breath visible as he exhaled. The younger officer approached, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. "Spread your arms," he said, gesturing roughly. James complied, his frustration mounting but his expression neutral. The older officer began patting him down, his hands moving briskly over James's coat and trousers. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," the younger officer said, his smirk widening. "And what description would that be?" James asked, his tone laced with barely restrained irritation. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the car, motioning for James to follow. "Open the trunk," he demanded. James did as he was told, pressing the button on his key fob. The trunk popped open, revealing nothing but a neatly packed briefcase and a spare tire. The officers exchanged a glance, their disappointment palpable. The older one stepped closer to James, his flashlight now aimed at the ground. "Why are you driving through this neighborhood?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "As I said earlier," James replied evenly, "I was rerouted because of the snow." The younger officer scoffed. "Funny, a man like you driving a car like this through here." James clenched his fists, the insult hanging heavily in the air. He knew what they were implying, and it took every ounce of restraint not to lash out. "Is there a problem?" he asked again, his voice quieter this time, but no less firm. The older officer stepped back, gesturing toward the snow-covered curb. "Kneel," he ordered. "What?" James's voice wavered slightly, disbelief washing over him. "You heard me," the officer snapped. "Kneel." Hands behind your head. James froze. The weight of the moment crashed down on him like the bitter cold surrounding them. He wanted to protest, to stand his ground. But the reality of the situation was painfully clear. With 2 armed officers in front of him and no witnesses in sight, his safety depended on compliance. Slowly, he sank to his knees, the icy snow soaking through the fabric of his trousers. He laced his fingers behind his head, his breath coming out in sharp, visible bursts. "Stay there," the older officer said, circling him like a predator sizing up its prey. The younger officer pulled out his phone, aiming it at James. "Let's see if you're as tough as you look," he sneered, snapping a picture. James felt the heat of humiliation rise in his chest, but he remained silent. The snow continued to fall around him, the icy flakes landing on his face and melting into cold rivulets that slid down his skin. "You can't treat me like this," James said finally, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. The older officer leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can do whatever we want." For the first time that night, James felt fear creep into his heart. The cold seeped through James's knees, biting into his skin and numbing his legs as he knelt on the icy ground. The snow was relentless, swirling around him in the harsh glow of the police car's headlights. His tailored trousers, once a mark of his professionalism and success, were now damp and clinging to his skin, stained by the dirt and ice beneath him. "All right, tough guy," the younger officer said, stepping forward with a smug grin plastered across his face. He held up his phone, its camera lens pointed directly at James. "How about a little exercise? Let's see you do some push-ups. Think you can handle that?" James's stomach churned. His hands, still clasped behind his head, trembled slightly. He wanted to protest, to call out the absurdity of their demand, but he knew better. These men held all the power, and any resistance could escalate into something far worse. "Come on," the younger officer prodded, his voice dripping with mockery. "We're waiting." The older officer, standing a few feet away with his flashlight trained on James, added in a low, menacing tone, "It's either that, or we take you in. Your choice." James swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the frigid air. Slowly, he lowered his hands, placing them on the frozen ground in front of him. The snow stung his palms, sharp and unforgiving. He could feel the damp cold soaking into his skin as he pushed his body up for the first time. "That's one." The younger officer counted loudly, his laughter echoing through the quiet street. "Keep going. Let's see what you've got." James moved through another push-up and then another, his body shivering uncontrollably. His breaths came out in visible puffs, quick and shallow, as the exertion combined with the freezing air. The muscles in his arms and chest burned, not from lack of strength, but from the sheer indignity of the act. "Look at him," the younger officer sneered, stepping closer to snap more photos. "Bet he's not used to getting his hands dirty." James gritted his teeth, his jaw clenched tightly as he continued to follow their humiliating orders. Each push-up felt like a blow to his dignity, a reminder of how powerless he was in this moment. His fingers, numb and raw, dug into the icy surface as he struggled to maintain balance. "Faster," the older officer barked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You call that effort?" The ridicule was relentless. Every word, every laugh felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into his pride. His breaths became ragged, the cold making it harder to draw in air. His vision blurred momentarily as sweat mixed with melting snow dripped into his eyes. Finally, his arms gave out, and he collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The younger officer crouched beside him, the phone still in hand, and snapped a close-up photo. "Pathetic," he muttered, shaking his head. James forced himself onto his knees again, his hands trembling as they hung limply at his sides. His entire body ached, the cold cutting through him like a knife. "Had enough?" the older officer asked, tilting his head slightly as if daring James to respond. James looked up at him, his breath visible in the freezing air. Despite the humiliation, despite the exhaustion, there was a fire in his eyes that refused to be extinguished. He didn't speak, but his silence carried a weight, a quiet defiance that the officers seemed to sense. The younger officer straightened, his smirk faltering slightly. "You think you're better than us?" he spat. "You think we don't see guys like you all the time? Flashy car, fancy suit, you're no different." James didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak, knowing that any word out of his mouth could be twisted into justification for further abuse. The older officer stepped forward, leaning in close. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was laced with venom. "This is what happens when people like you forget their place." The words hit James like a slap. He clenched his fists, the raw emotion bubbling just beneath the surface. But he didn't lash out. He couldn't. Not here, not now. After what felt like an eternity, the older officer stepped back, gesturing toward the police car. "All right, get out of here. And don't let us catch you around here again." James hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Was this another trick? Would they escalate if he moved too quickly? But then he saw the younger officer turn away, his attention already shifting, and James took the opportunity to stand. His legs wobbled as he rose to his feet, the blood slowly returning to his frozen limbs. He brushed the snow off his trousers with shaking hands, the gesture more out of instinct than anything else. Without a word, he turned and walked toward his car, his steps slow and deliberate. As he reached the driver's side door, he paused, his hand hovering over the handle. He didn't look back, but he could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their stares pressing against his back. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and climbed inside. The interior of the car was cold, the heater long since shut off. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as he sat in silence. The world outside was still, the snow continuing to fall in soft, steady flurries. James closed his eyes for a moment, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady his breathing. The events of the night played over and over in his mind, each moment sharper than the last. The humiliation, the cold, the helplessness, it all pressed down on him like a crushing weight. But beneath the pain, beneath the anger, there was something else, a flicker of resolve. He opened his eyes, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was tired, his eyes bloodshot, but there was a determination there that hadn't been present before. This wasn't over. James sat motionless in the car, the silence around him almost suffocating. The cold air inside bit at his face and hands, but he barely noticed. His fingers still trembled as they rested on the steering wheel, his knuckles sore from digging into the frozen ground. For a long moment, he couldn't bring himself to start the engine. His body ached, not just from the physical strain, but from the weight of humiliation that clung to him like the icy air. He took a deep breath, staring straight ahead through the frosted windshield. The dim glow of the streetlights barely pierced the darkness, their light blurred by the falling snow. In the rearview mirror, the red and blue lights of the police cruiser still flashed faintly in the distance, a haunting reminder of what had just happened. The officers were gone now, their laughter and mockery replaced by an empty, oppressive stillness. Finally, James forced his hand to turn the key. The engine sputtered to life, the sound breaking the silence like a reluctant sigh. The heater wheezed, trying to push warmth into the frozen cabin, but it would take time. James shifted into gear, his movements mechanical, and pulled back onto the snow-covered road. The tires crunched softly against the ice as he drove, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The street stretched endlessly in front of him, flanked by abandoned buildings and shadowy alleys. His thoughts raced, looping over every detail of the encounter. The jeering voices of the officers, the sting of their words, the camera flashes capturing his humiliation. Each memory felt like a fresh wound, raw and unrelenting. He tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw clenched as he struggled to push the memories aside. But they wouldn't leave. Their voices echoed in his mind. "People like you. Forget your place." Pathetic, the words wrapped around him, suffocating and unshakable. A sudden shiver ran through his body. His clothes were still damp, the wet fabric clinging to his skin. His trousers, once immaculate, were now wrinkled and stained, the sharp creases erased by the icy ground. His coat, an expensive piece he had worked hard to afford, was ruined, covered in patches of snow and dirt. He glanced down at his hands, the skin red and raw from the freezing pavement. The sight only deepened the ache in his chest. As he turned onto a main road, the lights of the city began to reappear in the distance, glowing faintly through the haze of snow. Home wasn't far now, but the closer he got, the heavier his heart became. He wasn't ready to face his wife, Angela, or their young daughter, Mia. How could he explain what had happened? How could he put into words the degradation he had endured? James felt his throat tighten, and for a moment, he considered pulling over. But he kept driving, forcing himself forward, 1 mile at a time. When he finally turned onto his street, the familiar sight of his house came into view. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the snow-covered lawn. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like a spotlight, illuminating the wreckage of his pride. He parked in the driveway, the engine rumbling softly as he sat in silence, staring at the house. Through the living room window, he could see Angela moving about, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of a lamp. James exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the inside of the windshield. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling again, not from the cold this time, but from the weight of what he was about to do. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped out into the snow. The icy wind hit him immediately, cutting through his already chilled body. His shoes crunched against the snow as he made his way to the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. He hesitated briefly before opening it, the warmth from inside washing over him in stark contrast to the cold outside. "James!" Angela's voice came from the living room, light and curious. "Is that you? You're late. Is everything?" She stopped mid-sentence as she stepped into the hallway, her eyes widening at the sight of him. His disheveled appearance, the dirt on his coat, the wet stains on his pants. It all told a story she didn't need to hear in words. "James, what happened?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. She hurried toward him, her hands reaching out instinctively to touch his arm. James didn't respond immediately. He avoided her gaze, instead brushing off some of the snow that clung stubbornly to his coat. His throat felt tight, the words refusing to come out. Finally, he whispered, "I got pulled over." Angela's brow furrowed. "Pulled over? For what? Did they?" "They humiliated me, Angela," he interrupted, his voice cracking. He looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "They made me kneel in the snow. They laughed at me. They made me." His voice broke completely, and he turned away, unable to finish. Angela's hands covered her mouth as the weight of his words sank in. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him despite his wet clothes. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you." James stood stiffly for a moment, but then his body gave in. He leaned into her embrace, his shoulders shaking as the tears finally came. He didn't sob aloud. He couldn't, but the silent tears spoke volumes. Angela held him tightly, her own tears falling as she rested her chin on his shoulder. After a long moment, James pulled back slightly, wiping his face with a trembling hand. "Mia," he said softly, glancing toward the hallway. "She's asleep, right?" Angela nodded. "She's in bed. She doesn't need to know." James let out a shaky sigh of relief. The thought of his daughter seeing him like this was too much to bear. He moved toward the living room, sinking into the couch with a heaviness that made it feel as though the cushions might collapse beneath him. Angela sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee. "You don't have to tell me everything right now," she said softly, "but we're going to figure this out. You're not alone in this, James." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the coffee table in front of him. His reflection stared back at him in the glass surface, distorted and faint. The man he saw there wasn't the man he knew, but he made a silent promise to himself, to Angela, to Mia, that he wouldn't let this break him. The sun rose reluctantly the next morning, casting a pale light over the snow-covered streets. Inside the house, James sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands. The steam rose in gentle curls, but he barely noticed. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the events of the previous night replayed in his mind. The flashing lights, the mocking voices, the icy ground beneath his palms. It was like a haunting reel on repeat, each frame more vivid than the last. Angela entered the room quietly, her steps soft against the hardwood floor. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. "You didn't sleep," she said gently. It wasn't a question. James shook his head. "I couldn't," he admitted, his voice low and rough. He glanced at the clock. It was barely 7 a.m., but he already felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. "I can't let this go, Angela. What they did, it wasn't just humiliating. It was wrong." She sat down across from him, her eyes filled with concern. "What are you going to do?" James took a deep breath, setting the coffee cup down. "I need proof. If I don't have evidence, it's just my word against theirs. And we both know how that'll end." Angela nodded, though her expression was hesitant. "Be careful, James. These men, they clearly don't care about consequences." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'll be careful," he promised, "but I can't stay silent. Not this time." Bundled in a thick coat and scarf, James stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face. The streets were quieter than usual, the storm from the previous night having left a blanket of fresh snow over everything. He walked with purpose, retracing the route he had taken home, each step stirring the memories he desperately wanted to bury. It didn't take long to reach the spot where it had all happened. The intersection looked deceptively ordinary in the daylight. The faint tracks of tires and footprints were already fading, swallowed by the new snowfall. But James's mind filled in the blanks, painting the scene in vivid detail. He could almost hear their voices again, the sharp commands, the cruel laughter. He stood there for a moment, his hands clenched into fists inside his gloves. This was where they had stripped him of his dignity. But this was also where he would begin to reclaim it. James scanned the area, his eyes landing on a small convenience store a short distance away. The sign above the door was faded, the glass windows fogged over from the heat inside. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward it, his boots crunching against the snow. Inside, the store was warm and cramped, shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to lottery tickets. Behind the counter stood an older man with a kind face, his graying hair tucked under a worn beanie. He looked up as James entered, his eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. "Morning," the man greeted cautiously. "Can I help you?" James approached the counter, his voice steady but firm. "I think you can. Do you have security cameras outside, facing the street?" The man hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the window. "Yeah, we've got cameras." "Why?" James took a deep breath. "Something happened out there last night. Something I need to prove." The man's expression grew wary. "What kind of something?" James hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to say too much, not yet. "I was stopped by the police. They didn't follow protocol. Let's just say that." The man's eyes softened slightly, his shoulders relaxing. "I've heard stories like that before," he said quietly. "Too many, if you ask me." He paused, then nodded toward the back of the store. "Come with me." James followed him through a narrow hallway that led to a small office. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and boxes, and a dusty monitor sat on a cluttered desk. The man tapped a few keys, pulling up the security footage from the night before. "There," he said, pointing to the screen. "That's the intersection, about 9:30 p.m., right?" James leaned closer, his breath catching as the grainy black and white footage began to play. He saw his car pulling to the side of the road, the police cruiser parking behind it. The two officers got out, their movements sharp and deliberate. The camera angle didn't capture audio, but it didn't need to. The body language told the story clearly enough. James's stomach tightened as he watched himself being pulled out of the car. The humiliation came rushing back with full force as he saw himself kneeling in the snow, his hands behind his head. The younger officer's phone flashed as he took pictures. It was all there. "I need a copy of this," James said, his voice shaking slightly. "Please." The man hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I want to help," he said carefully. "But if the cops find out I gave you this, they might come after me. I've got a business to protect." James met his gaze, desperation flickering in his eyes. "I understand, but if I don't have this, they'll get away with it." and they'll do it to someone else. Please. The man sighed, his shoulders slumping. All right, he said finally. But you didn't get it from me, understand? Thank you, James said, his voice filled with gratitude. You have no idea how much this means. The man inserted a USB drive into the computer, copying the footage onto it. He handed it to James, his expression serious. Be careful. You're messing with people who don't like being held accountable. James nodded, slipping the USB drive into his pocket. I will, he said. Thank you again. As James stepped back into the cold, the weight in his chest felt slightly lighter. He had the proof he needed. But this was just the first step. Holding the evidence in his pocket, he looked up at the gray sky, his breath forming soft clouds in the air. They had tried to strip him of his dignity. But now, he had a weapon of his own, the truth. He turned and began the walk home, his resolve hardening with each step. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The precinct was a cold, unwelcoming place. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh glare on the scuffed floors and walls lined with bulletin boards cluttered with outdated flyers. James tightened his grip on the USB drive in his pocket, feeling the edges dig into his fingers. It was a small object, but the weight it carried felt enormous. He had dressed carefully for this meeting, donning a sharp, dark suit that spoke of professionalism and confidence. But beneath the polished exterior, his stomach churned with unease. Every instinct told him he didn't belong here, that this was enemy territory. But he pushed the thought aside and approached the front desk. I'm here to see Chief Reynolds, James said firmly, meeting the receptionist's gaze. The young woman behind the desk raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. She picked up the phone, murmured something briefly, and then motioned toward the hallway. Second door on the left. He's expecting you. James nodded, his jaw tightening. Of course, the chief was expecting him. News traveled fast in places like this. He straightened his tie and walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the linoleum floor. Chief Reynolds was a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and a face that looked as though it had been carved from stone. He sat behind a massive oak desk, his posture relaxed but his sharp eyes assessing James as he entered the room. Mr. Carter, Reynolds greeted, his tone measured. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Have a seat. James sat, keeping his back straight and his expression calm. He reached into his pocket and placed the USB drive on the desk between them. I'm here to report an incident, James began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. An incident involving two of your officers. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his eyes flicking down to the USB drive before returning to James's face. I've heard about your concerns, he said slowly, but I'd like to hear your version of events. James took a deep breath and recounted everything. Being pulled over without cause, the insults, the humiliating push-ups in the snow, and the photos taken by the younger officer. He didn't embellish or exaggerate. The facts alone were damning enough. When he finished, Reynolds's expression remained unreadable. He tapped his fingers against the desk, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them. And you're saying you have evidence of this? Reynolds finally asked, nodding toward the USB drive. James nodded. It's all there. The entire interaction was captured by a security camera outside a convenience store. Reynolds sighed, leaning forward and picking up the USB drive. Mr. Carter, let me be clear. I take accusations like this very seriously. But you need to understand that police work isn't always neat. Sometimes, situations escalate. Mistakes are made. Mistakes? James repeated, his voice rising slightly. He forced himself to stay calm. Chief Reynolds, this wasn't a mistake. This was targeted harassment. Those officers didn't see me as a person. They saw me as someone they could humiliate for their own amusement. Reynolds held up a hand, cutting him off. I'll review the footage, he said, his tone clipped. And if there's evidence of misconduct, I'll handle it internally. James's eyes narrowed. Internally? With all due respect, Chief, that's not good enough. These men humiliated me in the middle of the street. They laughed at me, mocked me, and made me kneel in the snow like I was less than human. That's not something you handle internally. Reynolds's expression hardened. Mr. Carter, I don't appreciate being told how to do my job. And I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal for existing, James shot back. The tension in the room was palpable. For a moment, neither man spoke, their gazes locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Reynolds leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. I'll do what I can, he said, though the words lacked conviction. But you need to understand that these things take time. There are procedures we have to follow. James stood, his movements deliberate. I understand procedures, Chief. But let me make one thing clear. I won't let this be swept under the rug. If I don't see real action taken, I'll take this to the press. I have the evidence, and I'm not afraid to use it. Reynolds's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. James turned and walked toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Back in the parking lot, James sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The meeting had gone exactly as he'd expected. The chief had listened, nodded, and promised to review the evidence. But James knew better than to trust his words. The system wasn't built to hold people like those officers accountable. But James wasn't giving up. He stared out the windshield, his breath fogging the glass. He had taken the first step, but this was far from over. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and he picked it up to see a message from Angela. How did it go? He typed back quickly. About as well as I expected. I'll tell you everything when I'm home. As he started the engine, his resolve hardened. The humiliation he had endured would not be in vain. If the precinct thought they could dismiss him, they were wrong. He would fight this, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been silenced by abuse of power. This was only the beginning. James sat in his home office, the quiet hum of his computer filling the room as he scrolled through documents and emails. He had spent the last few days chasing leads, reaching out to people who might have experienced similar harassment by the police. The responses were disheartening. Some were too scared to talk. Others had tried and failed to seek justice. It felt like shouting into a void, the enormity of the system he was fighting pressing down on him. He paused, rubbing his temples. The anger and frustration threatened to overwhelm him, but he refused to let it win. The humiliation he had suffered wasn't just his burden to bear. It was a symptom of something larger, something he couldn't ignore. His determination grew stronger with each passing hour. Then, an email caught his attention. It was from one of his company's operations managers, flagged with urgent. The subject line read, "Police contract review needed." James clicked it open, his brow furrowing as he read. The email outlined the company's ongoing contracts with the local police department, which included maintenance and installation of security systems in precinct offices. His business was directly tied to the force that had harassed him. For a moment, James sat back, stunned. The irony was almost laughable. He had unknowingly been helping fund the very system that had dehumanized him. His fingers tightened around the edges of his desk, the wooden surface creaking slightly under the pressure. As the initial shock wore off, another realization dawned on him. This was his leverage. The police department relied on his company for critical services. If they thought they could dismiss him and sweep his case under the rug, they were wrong. He leaned forward, his heart pounding as a plan began to form in his mind. The next day, James scheduled a meeting with his lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Erica Williams. They sat across from each other in her sleek downtown office, the walls lined with shelves of thick legal volumes. Erica listened intently as James laid out everything. The harassment, the evidence, and now, the contracts. This changes everything, Erica said, her eyes lighting up with purpose. If your company provides essential services to the department, you hold significant leverage. They can't afford to alienate you. James nodded. I don't want to just threaten them. I want real change. Those officers need to be held accountable, and this system needs to stop protecting people like them. Erica smiled faintly. You've got the right mindset, James, but you need to be prepared. This won't just rattle the department, it'll rattle the entire system. They'll push back hard. I'm ready, James said firmly. I have to be. Later that week, James walked into the precinct once again, this time with Erica by his side. Her presence exuded authority, her tailored suit and confident stride commanding attention as they made their way to Chief Reynolds' office. The same receptionist from before glanced at them nervously but didn't stop them. Reynolds was sitting at his desk when they entered, his expression hardening as he saw James. "Mr. Carter," he said curtly, then nodded toward Erica. "And you are?" "Erica Williams, Mr. Carter's legal counsel," she replied smoothly. She placed a folder on the desk and opened it, revealing documents outlining James's company's contracts with the department. "We're here to discuss something of mutual interest." Reynolds glanced at the papers, his brows furrowing as he scanned the contents. "What is this?" "This," Erica said, her tone crisp, "is a detailed report of the services James Carter's company provides to your department. As you can see, it's quite extensive and critical to your operations." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "And what does this have to do with your complaint, Mr. Carter?" James spoke this time, his voice steady and calm. "It has everything to do with it, Chief. You've seen the evidence. You know what happened to me was wrong. But instead of taking action, you've dragged your feet, hoping I'd go away. Well, I'm not going away. In fact, I'm just getting started." Reynolds's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Erica stepped in. "If this department fails to address Mr. Carter's case properly, he is prepared to terminate all contracts with immediate effect. And as you know, that would leave your precinct in a very vulnerable position." Reynolds's face darkened. "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality," Erica replied sharply. "You've had every opportunity to do the right thing. Now, it's up to you whether this ends amicably or escalates further." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. James watched Reynolds closely, noting the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Finally, the chief exhaled through his nose, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'll look into the matter," he said grudgingly. "But these things take time." "No," James said firmly, leaning forward. "You've had time. I want action. Those officers need to be held accountable, and I want a public acknowledgement of what happened." Reynolds looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fine. You'll have your investigation, and I'll make sure it's thorough." James knew the concession wasn't made out of genuine remorse, but rather out of necessity. Still, it was a start. As James and Erica left the precinct, the cold air hit them like a wall. But this time, it didn't feel as oppressive. James took a deep breath, letting it out slowly as they walked toward the car. "You did good in there," Erica said, glancing at him. "But don't let your guard down. This fight isn't over yet." James nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. "I know, but for the first time, it feels like I've got a chance." They drove away, the precinct shrinking in the rearview mirror. For James, it wasn't just a building disappearing into the distance. It was the first crack in a system that had seemed impenetrable, and he intended to widen that crack until it shattered completely. The news broke on a cold Monday morning. Local headlines buzzed with the announcement that 2 officers from the precinct had been suspended pending an internal investigation. The statement was brief and carefully worded, filled with phrases like alleged misconduct and commitment to transparency. But for James, it was a small, satisfying crack in the wall of impunity he had faced. The community's response was immediate. On social media, the story spread like wildfire. Some users expressed outrage at the officers' actions, sharing their own experiences with police harassment. Others predictably defended the department, questioning James's credibility and motives. The divide was stark, but James wasn't focused on the noise. His eyes were set firmly on the goal, justice. At home, James sat at the dining table with Angela, scrolling through the comments on his phone. She reached over, gently placing her hand on his. "Don't read too much into those," she said softly. "You've done the right thing. That's what matters." "I know," James replied, though his voice carried a hint of doubt. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "It's just exhausting. Fighting this, dealing with people questioning my story. It's like reliving it all over again." Angela squeezed his hand. "You're stronger than this, James. They want you to give up. Don't let them win." Her words grounded him, rekindling the fire that had driven him this far. He nodded, sitting up straighter. "You're right. This isn't just about me. If I let this go, they'll do it to someone else. The days that followed were a whirlwind of developments. Chief Reynolds, under pressure from both internal scrutiny and public outcry, called a meeting with James and Erica. This time, his demeanor was notably different. Gone was the dismissive tone and thinly veiled hostility. In its place was a cautious, almost apologetic air. "We've reviewed the footage," Reynolds began, his voice measured. "And it's clear that the officers involved violated department policy. Their actions were unacceptable, and disciplinary measures are being taken." James listened intently, his face unreadable. He wasn't interested in half measures or vague assurances. "What exactly does disciplinary measures mean?" he asked, his tone firm. Reynolds hesitated briefly before continuing. "Effective immediately, the 2 officers in question have been terminated from their positions. Additionally, the department will issue a public apology acknowledging the misconduct." It was more than James had expected, and for a moment, he allowed himself a small sense of relief. But it wasn't enough. "And what about charges?" he pressed. "What they did wasn't just a violation of policy. It was a crime." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The matter has been referred to the district attorney's office. Any legal proceedings will be at their discretion." James exchanged a glance with Erica, who gave him a subtle nod. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. For now, it would have to do. The public apology came later that week. Standing before a podium in the precinct's press room, Reynolds read from a prepared statement. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the tension in his posture. "The actions of these officers do not reflect the values or mission of this department," he said. "We are committed to ensuring that such incidents are not repeated and to rebuilding trust with the community." James watched the broadcast from his living room, Angela by his side. The words felt hollow, rehearsed, but the fact that they were spoken at all was a victory in itself. It was a step toward accountability, a glimmer of hope in a system that so often seemed impenetrable. The next day, James received a phone call from an unknown number. He hesitated briefly before answering, bracing himself for whatever it might bring. "Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end said, its tone low and measured. "This is Assistant District Attorney Paul Turner. I'm calling to discuss the case involving the officers who harassed you." James straightened in his chair, his heart quickening. "Yes, I'm listening. We've reviewed the evidence provided, including the security footage," Turner continued, "and we believe there is sufficient cause to pursue charges against the officers. I wanted to inform you personally before we proceed." Relief washed over James like a wave, his grip on the phone tightening. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for taking this seriously." Turner's tone softened slightly. "No one should have to go through what you did, Mr. Carter. We'll be in touch with further updates." As the call ended, James set the phone down and leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, the weight on his chest lifting ever so slightly. News of the impending charges spread quickly. The community rallied around James, with local activists organizing a small protest outside the precinct. Signs reading "Justice for James" and "End Police Abuse" dotted the snowy landscape as people stood together, their voices echoing in the crisp winter air. James attended the protest, standing quietly among the crowd. It wasn't his style to seek the spotlight, but he knew how much it meant for people to see him there. As he looked around, he felt a surge of gratitude for the support that had carried him through the darkest moments. At one point, a young man approached him, his face earnest and determined. "Thank you for standing up," the man said. "People like me. We need to see that it's possible to fight back." James nodded, his throat tightening. "It's not easy," he admitted. "But if we don't fight, nothing changes." The charges against the officers marked a turning point, but James knew the battle was far from over. The legal process would be long and arduous, and the wounds from his experience would take time to heal. But as he stood among the crowd that day, he felt something he hadn't in weeks, a sense of hope. This wasn't just about his story anymore. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, every injustice that had been ignored. And as James looked out at the faces around him, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't fighting alone. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft rustling of papers and the occasional murmur from the gallery. James sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Erica on one side and a representative from the district attorney's office on the other. The officers who had humiliated him were on the opposite side of the room, their faces impassive but tense. The air was thick with anticipation as the judge entered, her gavel echoing loudly as it struck the block. It had taken months to get to this moment, months of hearings, motions, and relentless scrutiny. For James, every step had been a grueling test of his patience and resolve. But now, sitting here, he felt a sense of quiet determination. No matter the outcome, he had done everything in his power to stand up for himself and others like him. The prosecution presented the security footage, playing it on a large monitor for the courtroom to see. James watched as the scene unfolded. His car pulling over, the officer's aggressive approach, the push-ups in the snow, the mocking gestures. He had seen the footage countless times, but watching it here, in this solemn setting, it felt different, more real, more devastating. The defense tried to argue that the officers were following protocol, that the situation had been misinterpreted, but the evidence was undeniable. Witness testimonies from other victims of harassment by the same officers painted a clear picture of a pattern of abuse. By the time closing arguments were made, it was clear which direction the scales of justice were tipping. The verdict came 2 days later. James sat in the gallery with Angela beside him, her hand gripping his tightly. The judge's words seemed to hang in the air, each syllable carrying the weight of months of struggle. Based on the evidence presented, the judge declared, her voice firm and clear, the court finds the defendants guilty of misconduct, harassment, and abuse of authority. They are hereby sentenced to dismissal from the police force and will face additional penalties as determined by the district attorney's office. A wave of relief washed over James. His shoulders sagged slightly as the tension drained from his body. Angela squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with tears. It wasn't just a victory for him. It was a statement, a message that abuse of power would not go unchecked. In the weeks that followed, the case gained national attention. James found himself thrust into the spotlight, his story resonating with people across the country. He was invited to speak at community events, colleges, and even a televised panel on systemic racism and police reform. Though he was initially hesitant, Angela encouraged him to use his voice. "This isn't just about you anymore," she said one evening as they sat together in the living room. "You've started something, James. People are listening." At one of the events, James stood in front of a crowd of hundreds, the microphone feeling heavy in his hand. He looked out at the faces watching him, some hopeful, others angry, but all deeply engaged. "When those officers pulled me over," he began, his voice steady, "they thought they could humiliate me and walk away without consequences. They thought their badge gave them the power to strip me of my dignity. But they were wrong." He paused, taking a deep breath. "What they did to me was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem, a system that has allowed people like them to abuse their power for far too long. But change doesn't come from silence. It comes from action." The crowd erupted into applause, and James felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for the movement his story had sparked. But James didn't stop at speeches. He wanted to create lasting change. With Angela's support, he used his business connections to fund a new initiative, a program focused on training law enforcement in racial bias awareness and community engagement. The program emphasized accountability and empathy, with the goal of preventing the kind of abuse he had endured. The first session was held in the very precinct where his ordeal had begun. Chief Reynolds, now under significant public pressure, had reluctantly agreed to implement the training. James stood at the front of the room, facing a group of officers, many of whom avoided meeting his gaze. "I know what some of you are thinking," James began, his tone measured. "You think this is about punishment. It's not. It's about making sure no one else goes through what I went through. Because when one officer abuses their power, it undermines the trust we place in all of you." There was silence in the room, but James could see a few heads nodding slowly. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. Months later, James returned to the spot where it had all begun. The snow had melted, and the intersection looked unremarkable under the warm spring sun. But for James, it would always hold significance. a place of pain that had become the catalyst for something greater. A small plaque had been placed near the sidewalk, installed by local activists. It read, "In memory of those who have endured injustice. May this serve as a reminder to always stand against oppression." James stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, the words etched into the plaque resonating deeply. Angela and Mia joined him, their presence grounding him in the present. Mia, now old enough to sense that something important had happened, looked up at her father with wide eyes. "Daddy, is this where it happened?" she asked softly. James nodded, crouching down to her level. "Yes, sweetheart. But it's also where something good started." Mia tilted her head, her young mind processing his words. "Because you were brave?" James smiled, his eyes misting. "Because we were brave," he said, glancing at Angela. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who stood up and said, 'This isn't right.'" Mia nodded solemnly, as if making a silent promise to remember his words. As they walked back to the car, James felt a sense of closure. The journey hadn't been easy, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. But they were a reminder of his strength, a testament to what could be achieved when one refused to back down in the face of injustice. The road ahead was still long. The fight for systemic change would take years, decades even. But James knew that every step forward mattered, no matter how small. As the car pulled away, the plaque faded into the distance. But its message remained, etched not just in metal, but in the hearts of those who had been inspired by James's story. And as the city skyline came into view, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, James allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He had stood against the storm, and he had prevailed.